Let me tell you something that completely overturns the conventional understanding of global finance. As of late 2025, the United States government carries roughly $36 trillion in total national debt, making it the largest debt accumulation in human history. But here is the truly shocking part. The United States has structured this debt in such a way that the more it borrows, the more leverage it gains over the countries lending to it. This creates a perverse dynamic where America's creditors are often more afraid of a US default than the US itself is afraid of losing access to borrowing. This arrangement is unprecedented in financial history, and as of late 2025, it is beginning to fracture in ways that could reshape the global economic order. To understand why, you have to look at who actually owns America's $36 trillion debt. As of late 2025, US government debt is held across several broad categories. Domestic holders own approximately 25 to 26 trillion dollar, about 70% of the total, held by Americans and US institutions. Foreign holders own roughly 8.5 trillion dollars, about 23 to 24%, held by foreign governments, institutions, and individuals. The Federal Reserve owns approximately 4.5 to 5.0 trillion dollars, or about 13 to 14%, representing debt held by America's own central bank. These categories overlap somewhat, which is why the totals do not sum perfectly to $36 trillion. Looking first at foreign creditors, this is where the story becomes especially revealing. Japan remains the largest foreign holder of US Treasury securities in 2025 with roughly $1.1 trillion. However, Japan's holdings over 2024-2025 have been essentially flat. Japan is no longer increasing its exposure even as US borrowing continues to rise by trillions each year. China is the second largest foreign holder, with approximately $775 billion in treasuries as of 2025. This represents a massive decline from China's peak holdings of over $1.3 trillion in 2013-2014. Between 2022 and 2025, China systematically reduced its treasury holdings by more than $550 billion, actively decreasing exposure to US debt while pursuing de-dollarization. The United Kingdom holds approximately $775 billion, ranking third, though much of this is held through London-based financial institutions on behalf of global investors rather than by the UK government itself. Luxembourg and Ireland each hold roughly 300 to 350 billion, largely reflecting their roles as global financial hubs. Switzerland and the Cayman Islands each hold around 280 to 300 billion, with Cayman holdings largely representing hedge funds and offshore vehicles. Belgium holds approximately 350 billion dollars, often acting as a custodian for European entities. Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, India, Hong Kong, and others each hold between 100 to 250 billion dollars. Altogether, foreign official holdings, meaning foreign governments and central banks, total approximately 8 to 8.5 trillion in 2025, about 23 to 24% of total US debt. This is down sharply from roughly 34% in 2015. Foreign ownership has steadily declined as the US borrows more and foreign governments buy proportionally less. Now consider domestic holders, where the structure becomes truly unusual. The Federal Reserve holds approximately 5.0 trillion in treasuries. Because the Fed is part of the US government system, this means one arm of the government owes money to another. These holdings were accumulated primarily during quantitative easing programs from 2008 through 2022, when the Fed created money electronically and used it to buy government bonds. Interest paid on this debt flows back to the Treasury, meaning the government is effectively paying interest to itself. US government trust funds hold roughly 6.5 trillion in treasuries. The Social Security Trust Fund alone holds about 2.8 trillion dollar. Military retirement funds hold over 1 trillion, while civil service and Medicare trust funds hold hundreds of billions more. These funds accumulated surpluses over decades, which by law were invested in Treasury securities. This means the government borrowed from its own programs to fund general operations. When these trust funds redeem bonds to pay benefits, as is now happening, the Treasury must raise cash through taxes or additional borrowing. This is internal accounting, not external financing. State and local governments hold roughly $800 billion to $1 trillion in treasuries. U.S. mutual funds hold about 2.5 to 3.0 trillion dollars. American households directly hold 2.5 trillion dollars through savings bonds and brokerage accounts. US banks hold 1.5 trillion dollars for liquidity and regulatory purposes. Pension funds hold 1.5 to 2.0 trillion dollars, and insurance companies hold between $500 billion and $1 trillion dollars. Combined, domestic holders account for roughly $26 trillion, about 70% of total US debt. This structure gives the United States extraordinary power. Foreign creditors cannot easily sell their holdings without inflicting large losses on themselves. If China attempted to rapidly dump $750 billion in treasuries, prices would fall, yields would spike, and China would incur substantial losses long before exiting. Creditors are effectively trapped. At the same time, domestic ownership makes political default virtually impossible. A default would devastate retirement accounts, money market funds, banks, pensions, social security, and state reserves. Voters would never accept this outcome. As a result, the US can continue borrowing because domestic institutions are structurally compelled to keep buying treasuries. Banks, pensions, insurers, and retirement funds require large quantities of safe assets, and treasuries are essentially the only option at scale. The Federal Reserve adds another layer. If buyers ever disappear, the Fed can step in and create money to buy government debt, as it did in 2020-2021. This makes the US uniquely resilient compared to countries that cannot directly monetize debt. However, this system is now straining. Foreign official buying has effectively stopped in 2024-2025. Japan is flat, China is selling, others are not increasing holdings. Meanwhile, the US is borrowing $1.6 to $2.0 trillion per year. Domestic buyers have absorbed nearly all new issuance, but they are approaching capacity limits. As a result, yields have risen sharply, with 10-year treasuries at 4.5% instead of near zero as in the 2010s. Higher yields are driving interest costs above $1.1 trillion annually, heading toward 1.3 to 1.4 trillion. If yields rise to 5 to 6%, interest costs could reach $1.6 to $1.8 trillion, consuming over 20% of federal revenue. That creates a feedback loop of higher deficits, more borrowing, and higher interest costs. The Federal Reserve is trapped. Reducing its balance sheet pushes yields higher and stresses markets. Expanding it risks inflation and dollar depreciation. If the Treasury market becomes dysfunctional, the Fed may be forced to resume large-scale purchases. Globally, the dollar system is also evolving. A large share of global debt is denominated in dollars, creating structural demand for dollars to service those debts. But more countries are shifting toward local currency borrowing, alternative settlement systems, and non-dollar financing. As dollar-denominated debt declines over time, structural demand for dollars weakens. Looking ahead to 2026-2030, the US faces a narrowing set of choices: painful fiscal adjustment, accelerating deficits, or monetary financing. None are painless. The real question is no longer who owns America's debt, but who is willing to keep buying new debt. For decades, the US benefited from a world with no alternatives. As of 2025, alternatives are emerging. The extraordinary privilege that allowed unlimited borrowing at low cost is fading. America structured its debt so creditors were trapped. But in 2025, that leverage is slowly disappearing.